into the second series of lectures under the Biodiversity Documentation Project of Hope. And this lecture is being held in memory of our former president of Hope Nature Trust, Dr. Deepa Rathi. And I'm sure all of you know her. She was the almost single handed inspiration for the successful organization of Pakshi Mitra Sammelan at Thane. She's not there with us today, but we all miss her and her enthusiasm. So this lecture is in her memory. As a respect to her, we will be holding this lecture every year, and this is the second in that series. And today we have Dr. Deepak Apte, who is the former director of VNHS, a well-known marine ecologist, talking to us about experiences of underwater research and his experiences in enhancing the conservation of coral reefs of Lakshadweep. Before we get into the lecture today, in the last just a few days back, we missed one of the greatest companion of Hope Nature Trust, Sri Ullas Rani ji. He was a pillar of inspiration to many of us who have been working close to him. He has left behind an immense legacy of highly motivated young naturalists who I'm sure will be available to all of us for forwarding the cause of conservation of this planet. Before we start this lecture today, I request all of you to maintain 1 minute silence in his very respectful memory. I'll come back to you exactly after a minute. Thank you. I'm sure Ullas's spirit and his enthusiasm and his motivation will always push us forward, including the Hope Nature Trust. Coming to today's talk would be delivered by Dr. Deepak Apte, who is a well-known marine ecologist, as I just mentioned. He is also he was also the director of Bombay Natural History Society. If I want to talk about him, I will just say that he is one great example for citizen science. I mean, we are talking about biodiversity documentation. He is one person who entered into professional marine ecology studies with his passion and his hobby of collecting shells. And it was his passion, it was his perseverance, and it was his wholehearted involvement in collection of shells, that in a small village which was close to the seashore, he used to collect shells. And then he started collecting shells from all over India, all along the sea coast of India, at a very young age. Almost when he was 2021, he could send one of his shells to Smithsonian to identify which shell was that. And this is the kind of perseverance that we all must have. And I'm sure even a small hobby like that will develop you into a big conservationist and a natural history specialist. I take this example deliberately because at that time when he collected shells, it was a simple hobby, but he pursued it in a systematic manner, and that culminated in him writing a book on shells of India, which is one of the best publication on field guides of shells of India. Talking about him, he is a doctorate in zoology and he has done post graduation in several fields. Of course, zoology he completed, and then he had integrated coastal zone management from Bangkok, and of course, the marine policy from Duke University, USA. In BNHS, he is a principal scientist and he completed his tenure of 5 years in BNHS as its director. And now he has focused his interest in climate change effects in Himalaya, wetlands, and Central Asian flyway, which is a very, very important thing for India. And then, of course, the marine and coastal biodiversity. He has a lot of recognitions for his work and the areas that he has covered, both before he started his tenure as a director of BNHS and, of course, after his taking up the marine ecology project at Lakshadweep. He got the Green Oscar Whitley Award. He also has the Global Fellowship for the Marine Conservation by Duke University, USA. He is a fellow of Lead India International Visitors Program of USA. He got the Vasundhara Green Teacher Award, and he also has been awarded the Rotary Respectful Award of Trasru Lalwani for his environmental conservation effects. He has written 5 books, many of which are popular, and he has almost 5,000 hours of diving, and he is an accomplished underwater photographer. He has about 65 research papers in very, very prestigious journals, and when I say prestigious journal, they are ones with those very high scientific value. He is member of several governmental committees on conservation. He is also member of the wildlife board in several states, including Andaman and Nicobar, which I am sure he would love to preserve those coastal areas as close to his heart as possible. He has contributed to several national and international policies through his experience on marine ecology conservation. Currently, he is guiding 3 students for their PhD, and I'm sure we have a very excellent and eminent speaker today to talk to us about his experiences of underwater research, a domain which is very difficult and needs a lot of skill. And I'm sure he would give you experiences where he had even life threatening experiences underwater. His work has been on the giant clams, which a very small number of individuals you get in on the coral reef, but they can tell you the entire ecology of the coral reef, like how we would study the tiger and know the habitat of the forest in which this tiger is living. So over to Deepak Apte. Thank you.
Thank you, Shashi. It's pleasure and privilege for me to have you as a teacher during my early days of career. Uh, and you always been a genius teacher for all of us. Our generation still remember Shashi Menon as one of the genius of Ruya. Thank you, Shashi. I think I'm going to present more of a general perspective about coastal and marine, because if I have to speak on coral reef, it will get extremely technical, and it's one of the most difficult subject to actually present in a very simple fashion to layman audience who probably doesn't understand the complexity of this subject. So what I'm going to do really is run through some very, very interesting and fascinating aspects of marine and coastal biodiversity. Can you see the slides?
Yes, yes, we can see,
All right.
Deepak.
Okay, great. I think before we go to the main presentation, giving overview of coastal and marine aspect, it's very important for us to understand that ocean makes almost 71% of surface and 97% of Earth's water and 99% of the living space. So minus ocean, there is nothing, actually speaking, for the planet point of view. It also 37% of the world population directly depend on marine and coastal biodiversity for livelihoods. Now that's a huge, I would say, both a pressure as well as a resource that we are talking about. And when you have such a large population depend on this vital ecosystem, obviously the conservation challenges are going to be of multi-dimensional. I'm not going to really go into details of the issues in today's presentation. I will give more of a very interesting perspective of how beautiful this life underwater is. It's very,
Deepak, I
yeah.
think you can hold the mic a little away.
Okay, okay. Is that okay now?
Yeah, that is okay. Yeah.
Okay, because all right. Thanks. Sorry. Okay. Uh, so why India is so important in terms of coastal and marine biodiversity? Uh, Obviously, we have got about 8,000 plus kilometer of coastline. We have got 9 coastal states and 4 union territories. Two of the best coral reef formations in the form of Lakshadweep archipelago and Andaman Nicobar Island. But we have to three another very interesting reef systems that we have. I'll speak about those slightly later. We are among the 12 megabiodiverse countries globally, and one of the reason why we are diverse is because of the ecosystem diversity that we have, both marine and terrestrial. More than 20% of the coastline, is within Andaman Nicobar and Lakshadweep. And since these three together forms a formidable area for very, very, very rich marine biodiversity, obviously India ranks very, very high in terms of coastal and marine biodiversity. And if you add to this 8,000 kilometer, more than 2.2 million square kilometer of exclusive economic zone, it's a massive marine realm that we currently have access to. And that's something it's very, very important to understand, because what we know about marine biodiversity is only fraction of what we have, because our access to this realm is very, very limited. There are a huge number of challenges we have when you want to study coastal and marine biodiversity. Intertidal areas relatively are better because we have a better access to that. But subtidal areas are always a challenge, not just now, previously as well, because it becomes very, very expensive to do underwater studies, because the amount of time you require, get out there, the kind of equipment you require, the kind of safety precautions that you have to take, the kind of risks you are into. It's been primarily limiting factor why there are not many researchers working in subtidal areas in India even now. But to understand marine and coastal biodiversity, I think you have to understand its dynamics. Uh, I think it's one of the most complex ecosystem to say to understand. Look at, for example, these tiny bubbler crabs. Wherever you go in coastal areas, in sandy shores during low tide, you'll find these lovely designs on the sandy beaches. Uh, they're essentially formed by these tiny crabs on left-hand side. If you can see, they're called the bubbler crabs. Uh, but it's not the design which is really important in that sense, but it's the role these tiny crabs perform in ecosystem. In fact, these are nature's some of the best recycling agents. These are the tiny organisms which do very effective nutrient recycling in ecosystem. And speaking specific to coral reef ecosystem, I think it's very important to understand, like your rainforest on land, coral reefs underwater are nutrient deficient ecosystem. So what you mean by nutrient deficient ecosystem? That unless it has got a very high efficient system of recycling of nutrients, this ecosystem on its own cannot survive for very long, because the nutrient aspect is very, very low in this ecosystem. And that's how ironical that aspect is, that coral reefs are one of the most productive ecosystem on earth, yet ecologically these are nutrient deficient ecosystem. And therefore all these tiny things that today we believe are very insidious creatures play a great role in maintaining reef as an ecosystem. Now, for example, you look at this humphead parrotfish. Humphead parrotfish essentially you will find in the reef areas. They usually are not found in other ocean realms. The role they play is very, very vital. First thing, of course, is they break down the dead corals into sand, and almost one single parrotfish in a year produce almost 5 ton of coral sand. Most of the tropical coral islands that you see where you have this coral sand, this one particular fish is a great contributor to that. It's not the only one, but this is the one great contributor to that. More importantly, what these parrotfish do is they will remove dead coral debris from a reef, paving way for formation and recruitment of new corals. So they essentially create new habitat, new substrate in a coral reef ecosystem. Yet we do not recognize the contribution of these species into reef building. They are harvested in large number in many areas for food, not understanding the deep impact the diminishing population of such species can have on very, very fragile and delicately balanced ecosystem like coral reefs. Puffer for example, very, very interesting fish. I think for biochemists, this is something which is worth studying in terms of the neurotoxin it produces through its various body organs. And it's been known very recently that bottlenose dolphin, intake moderate amount of fish toxin in order to get intoxicated and high. I mean, that's how intricate relations we have in ocean realm. Aribadas, again, I need not speak about it. I think it's very well known phenomena. We have this in coast of Orissa. More than a million female olive ridleys visit annually to lay eggs on some of these most beautiful sandy areas. And it's the second such known phenomena globally for olive ridleys. And the giant clam, which Shashi has mentioned, my entire last two decades work is on this particular species. I think it's an extraordinary species in invertebrate realm. It has a lifespan of over 200 years. It's fixed at one place and grow over a meter. And it's a very, very interesting mode of living this species has. This is only species alongside coral. They are what we call it as endosymbionts. What you mean by endosymbionts? These clams usually don't feed on anything else except zooxanthellae, which is present inside its body, inside its tissue. And along with circulatory system, blood circulatory system, these animals have got a zooxanthellae circulatory system, which is an independent circulatory system within its body. So what happens is during the sunlit times, this mantle will remain open, the clam is open, and all the zooxanthellae will come near the mantle. That's where you see these beautiful colors. The colors will vary from all the way from brown to green to neon blue, depending on the light penetration. And it will acquire sunlight to produce the food and carbon dioxide. And that carbon dioxide then helps in terms of recycling of nutrients within the tridacna. And then what happens during the time when there is, when there is not sufficient sunlight available, especially in rainy days when the sunlight is very, very poor, these animals will go into autophagous mode, is that they will feed on zooxanthellae within its body. So this is one animal which cultivates its own farm, zooxanthellae farm inside its body. And that's the secret of this animal living for more than 200, 300 years, to say. Unfortunately, the situation and the status of this species globally is extremely precarious because they have been harvested for souvenirs and food for many, many years. Now there are, of course, number of efforts to restore them through sea ranching. It's been quite successful in many parts, and India certainly need to look at that as an aspect. Now, sea cucumbers recently has been in a great news that in Lakshadweep there are series of seizures happened for illegal, harvesting of sea cucumbers. Again, a very, 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 very important species in coral reef ecosystem, because these are some of the most vital ingredients, what we call it as nutrient recyclers in a nutrient deficient ecosystem. So what happens is basically this sea cucumbers will take a lot of sand with organic matter. That organic matter will be converted into a nitrogen rich pellets which will be thrown out every day. And it converts a very complex nutrient breakdown into very simple nitrogen, which essentially is required in this nutrient deficient ecosystem. So there has been a huge debate going on currently under Wildlife Protection Act And there are pressure groups, especially the fishermen groups, who want to utilize this in harvest. Currently, they are all protected under Wildlife Protection Act, Schedule 1, so you cannot really harvest this resource. And there are efforts to establish the fact that they have very good population, so you allow harvesting of this species. Uh, People don't try to understand that absolute densities many a times doesn't help to make good decision. You need to understand ecological density of these species because they perform such a vital function of ecosystem process maintenance. That simple or absolute density uh, for deciding the harvest is the last mistake we want to make as a policy. And unless, therefore, we start looking at sea ranching as an option, it is not wise to allow harvesting of the species. The species can certainly be harvested. It has a great market, has a good food potential, but not in a current form and fashion. It is best to start sea ranching. And in that sense, I think our acts are also very, very rigid. Now, under Wildlife Protection Act, if you have to do sea ranching, it's a very tedious, cumbersome process to actually be able to do that. And therefore, we need to look at, if you want to save the species, you have to look management of the species in a very different fashion. And in coral reef ecosystem, the species are absolutely vital. In absence of this species, the reef system simply won't survive for long. And then moms are as ferocious when it comes to their kids. uh, don't mess with some of these fishes, especially when they are nesting, when they're on the eggs, especially the parrot fishes and trigger fishes. They're very aggressive. Their bites really nasty. And these are the little experiences you can get when you start working underwater, is to learn to respect this nature. If you look at this parrotfish, look at this very powerful teeth present on one side. It really gives very, very nasty bites. I've been bitten once, but only once. I don't want to experience that once more. And then the jellyfishes, frighteningly powerful venom, and among the most deadly in the world. Its tentacle grows up to 3 meters. They have started invading tropical seas with climate change. Earlier, they're confined mostly to Australia and Coral Triangle, but now you can see in Indian waters, you will get these box jellyfishes in Andaman Nicobar. At times in Lakshadweep, not in great numbers, but on and off, there are records coming through mainland coastal areas as well. And we have to be mindful of it because we are never used for this kind of species when we go for recreational swimming in these waters. So that's the consequences we are today having. We are seeing the trends of how species distribution ranges all getting skewed and very, very unreliable, unrealistic way. That there is a huge scope in this dimension to understand how these species are spreading from one coastal zone into completely different realm with this whole climate change scenario. And there are very interesting marathon swimmers and flyers that you will see. I'm not going to speak on bird migration per se because it has nothing to do uh, in coastal and marine point of view. For waders, of course, they are important areas because millions and millions of these migratory birds use these pristine mudflats that we have as foraging areas. And it's very important for us to understand that for Central Asian Flyway, which is a very, very important program for us, for India, because there are millions and millions of migratory birds from Arctic Russia visit India through Central Asian Flyway. They require very, very productive mudflats. And it's again a very good lesson for policymakers that wherever we see open mudflat, we see it's a great area for mangrove plantation. Actually, it's very counterproductive. And what we are now talking about is that non-vegetated mudflats should remain the way they are because these non-vegetated mudflats are rather very important foraging areas for these migratory birds. So not all open barren mudflats as you see are required or available for mangrove plantation. And we require a very serious policy shift in the way we are doing aggressive mangrove plantation in a very haphazard manner. Wherever we see open mudflats, we believe that that's a great area to do mangrove plantation, which is absolutely, absolutely against uh, the Central Asian flyway conservation interest. And that's the science we need to understand. And for those who don't understand, don't know much about these migratory birds, now look at this tiny Arctic 110-gram tern which makes the longest migration in the world with annual round trip of 71,000 kilometers. From where these tiny birds get that energy, how they manage to overcome so much of adversaries when they uh, crisscross trans-oceanic movements. Look at this longest non-stop flight recently recorded for last few years by Bartel Godwit. It's a tag bird moving right from New Zealand to Alaska, 11,500 kilometers non-stop, 9 days flight. That's what the newer technology, cutting edge science is providing insight into how incredible life of this nature is, uh, that even today our most sophisticated planes cannot fly that far, without taking stopover sites in between. And this tiny animal, a tiny bird, can actually fly non-stop, uh, cutting across uh, transoceanic flight all the way from New Zealand to Alaska. I think it's unbelievable. And I think that is why we need to really respect nature in that sense, because it's something we cannot co-create. It's not something that we can, replace very easily. And it's not just this particular bird. Look at Sooty Shearwater, 65,000 kilometer, New Zealand to North Pacific. Humpback whales, almost 20,000 plus kilometer Antarctic to Pacific. Leatherback turtle, 20,000 kilometer. Elephant seals, 21,000 kilometer. I mean, what kind of scale we are talking about in terms of migration? It's phenomenal. A leatherback turtle, very well studied by one of a few of our Indian researchers in Andaman Nicobar, and see where the tracks have led them, this kind of information. So, use of technology is very, very important. Demystifying secrets of some of these uh, unbelievably beautiful world of underwater realm. Marine biodiversity, again, it's spectacular. I mean, it's my life passion. I can speak hours and hours and hours on marine biodiversity. Uh, you got to go underwater. Intertidal areas are not the areas where you will really understand marine biodiversity. Marine biodiversity is really there. You have to be in water to see the life they have. It is spectacular life. It's extremely colorful. But not all is well in our marine environment. There are large number of species getting into category of endangered in nature, and that's not something we should proud of. I mean, dugongs, for example, we are only about 200 odd left. Whether it's humpback whale, whether it's whale shark, whether it's leatherback turtle, whether it's rugged tooth shark, or whether it's oceanic white-tip shark or giant clams. All these species, unfortunately, today are getting into that endangered category for two reasons. I think uh, one, of course, is a human-induced issues, because we are altering their ecosystems much more rapidly than what they can adapt to. And secondly, the climate change also forcing many of these species to shift their distribution ranges, which currently we have no idea how it's going to progress in years to come as climate crisis aggravates over the next couple of decades. So it's something that we need to watch very, very carefully, because what happens underwater have influence on what happens on land. And rather, it's what happens on land is controlled by what happens in ocean. And therefore, El Nino and El Nina that we speak about, when there is a warm water current and cold water current, decides the rain patterns, and rain pattern decides the economy of many, many countries. And therefore, we cannot undermine and ignore oceans if you want to address conservation challenges on land. And I think that is a missing link today in our policy. That what will happen if ocean becomes acidic? How it is going to influence the oceanic processes? And in terms how these processes will influence what happens to the rain pattern is something we need to understand deeply, so that we can do better mitigation measure. And then sea turtles, if you go to Lakshadweep, you'll see them in their best of elements. I mean, I have pleasure and privilege of diving with this hawksbill and green sea turtle in Lakshadweep for many, many years. And I think you just have to be there to believe how beautiful it looks to swim with these turtles. I cannot explain. I don't have words. I'm not a poetic person, so I will not be able to explain what that feeling is when you fly with them underwater in a very calm, cool waters of Lakshadweep. And then everything in reef is colorful. The fishes, look at the colors, dazzling colors. Uh, these animals have underwater. Everything underwater is colorful. From tiny to giant and majestic, everything, echinoderms, whether it's sea cucumber, whether it's starfishes, whether it's sea urchin, whether it's feather stars, everything is colorful. Look at shrimps, tiny shrimps, few centimeters in size, to crabs, small and large, symbiotic, non-symbiotic. Everything has got a color combination, everything which is stunningly beautiful. All that you need is you need to spend some peaceful time with these animals to genuinely appreciate beauty of their color and their natural state. Octopuses and squids, how beautiful they are when you're diving with them is something that you only have to experience. Sea slugs, tiny, it's getting very popular these days. Sea slugs, after my book on sea slugs of India, I think a lot of now our young citizen science groups are picking up on these tiny animals, and we are getting some fantastic data through this individual enthusiasts who are combing our intertidal areas. But they are extremely interesting group of animals. A lot of bioactive molecule properties worth doing research in terms of what kind of helpful substances these animal secrets must possess for human use is something only science will be able to decipher. And then corals, and both soft and hard corals. Uh, there is quite a bit of a debate currently on this whole coastal road and corals. I think we need to understand the basic difference between the coral reefs and corals we speak. Because what we see in Mumbai, these are not reef building corals, really. I mean, you will get this kind of corals almost all coastal states quite regularly. There's nothing really extraordinary about it. But the corals, which are reef building corals, they are very, very different. I mean, they are much more dynamic, they are much more fragile, their ecosystem processes and requirements are very, very different than non-reef building corals. Sea anemones, again, very, very colorful. You will see in reef areas. The coelentrates are, again, worms, for example. I mean, these are all relatives of earthworm. And look at how beautiful the feather dusters they have as a mouth part into this burrowing life forms. Everything in marine realm has colors. That's the beauty of it. But the only interesting thing that when you're diving, you need to understand that none of these colors are visible to you once you go below 10 meter. As you know, as you go underwater at every meter, a different spectrum of light will get absorbed. And below 10 meter, what you see, in fact, all red, all yellow, and all this color orange will disappear below 10 meter. So below 10 meter, what you see is not this color. The colors you see only when you put artificial light. So if you are not carrying a good quality torch with you or a camera with good quality flash, you will never be able to see this color below 10 meter. Below 10 meter, everything looks monochromatic. It all looks green or light blue. I may have some of the images that I will try to show at some point of time. What we have done in terms of conservation for marine resource, frankly speaking, very little and very limited. We have marine protected areas. We have about 130 coastal and marine protected areas over 8,200 square kilometer of a coastline. MPAs form only about 3.85% of total protected areas in this country. And if you look at even the marine protected areas, most of them are present, almost 100 plus in Andaman Nicobar Island. And among those, most of them are either meant to protect either saltwater crocodile nesting areas or sea turtle nesting areas. Pure marine and areas which probably protect coral reefs or protect tidal mudflats or protect mangroves or protect sea grasses are not more than 20 to say. And that's a very unfortunate story of marine conservation in India. We still have long way to go protecting these areas. But I believe that Wildlife Protection Act is not going to be useful in doing declaring more and more marine protected areas. For me, Wildlife Protection Act is it's quite a draconian act in that sense that it prohibits access of communities to their livelihood. And when it comes to ocean and fishermen, fishermen cannot live without ocean, without harvesting those resources from ocean is their primary livelihood. So I feel we have to find ways by which we can create more and more community conserved areas where we give a great ownership and great decision making powers to local communities so that they become equal stakeholder and custodians in decision making uh, so far as use of these resources concerned. Uh, we have about 9 critical areas identified. There are a lot more. These are the one which I would call it as, the areas with prime importance: Andaman Nicobar, Lakshadweep, Gulf of Kutch, Gulf of Kambat, Mannar, Vitarkanika, Sundarban, Gulf of Malvan, and Gulf of Karwar. Recently, BNHS concluded project in Maharashtra to identify ecologically sensitive areas, and we realized there are at least 7 important clusters only in Maharashtra that we need to look at for conservation point of view. Every state, if you do that exercise, will come up with some very interesting information. I'll run through very basic academics on coral reef, those who are interested. A very, very distinct and unique ecosystem. And if you look at the key coral reef areas in India, I would say Gulf of Mannar is about 94 square kilometers, and it's affected to almost 60 to 80% during 1998 bleaching event. And recovery has been relatively very, very slow, but it's one of the most studied coral reef formation in India. I think some of the best research paper and maximum number of research paper are from Gulf of Mannar. Gulf of Kutch, the northernmost reef in India, very, very unique. It's about 325 square kilometer in the form of marine national park and sanctuary. These are the corals which has got relatively very high thermal tolerance. And the secret is there in the clade of zooxanthellae that it possesses. And it's a very interesting experiment that we are trying to suggest to government that instead of doing translocation from Lakshadweep to Gulf of Kutch, which surely will not survive because Lakshadweep has got clade C, which is very, very prone to elevated sea surface temperature, while as Gulf of Kutch has got clade D, which is much more resilient to temperature. So we are suggesting the species which are found both in Gulf of Kutch as well as in Lakshadweep, same species. If you do reverse translocation from Gulf of Kutch to Lakshadweep, maybe that's something we should explore as the future remedy for elevated sea surface temperature, because we believe clade D may be a solution. That is one of the reasons why Gulf of Kutch, despite having bleaching events, has not resulted into the kind of mortality that we have seen in other reef formations, be it Mannar or Lakshadweep or Andaman Nicobar. And Andaman Nicobar is about 1,000 plus square kilometer, about spread across 530 islands. It's both barrier and fringing reefs that you will see there. Lakshadweep again about 2,000 kilometers, 2,000 kilometer, chain of atolls, but total reef area is about relatively about 1,000 square kilometer. It's purely atoll ecosystem, very, very different than either platform or barrier or fringing reef. And recently, not known recently. I mean, Angria Bank has been known for several centuries. That's why that's how it's been given Angria as a name. Fishermen know about it for many, many centuries. But for researchers' point of view, we came to know very recently is about 400 square kilometer submerged reef bank. It's a deep water reef compared to other reefs. It starts at about 25-30 meter. But again, very, very interesting reef formation. And then we have, besides this, many, many small reef areas like Netrani in Karnataka, Malvan in Maharashtra, scattered across uh, east and west coast of India. And then we have what we call it as patchy reefs, which are again mostly found in coastal Konkan, Ratnagiri and Sindhurga. What we see in Mumbai and Raigad and all these currently news are really they're not really the reefs. These are non-reef building corals, which you will see uh, almost entirely right from Gujarat all the way up to Orissa in intertidal areas. If you have traversed through the intertidal areas, there's not something unique about it. But these are some of the reefs on west coast of India. Angria Bank beautiful reef. Ratnagiri, we get intertidal porous kind of reformation. Now, these are reef building corals, porous. In Vijayadurga, we have got Turbinaria predominantly, which is again a rebuilding coral. And then we have sorry, Netrani is again in Karnataka, beautiful reef, very small reef area. Lakshadweep purely atoll, mostly lagoon reef, which are predominantly acropora and complex of massive corals. And Malvan again is predominantly with turbinaria and massive corals. Gulf of Mannar, you will again see a lot of acropora plate forms. And Andaman Nicobar is a complex of more than 400 species of corals you will see in Andaman Nicobar Island on the east coast of India. Structurally, all these corals are very, very different from each other. And structure really depends on the canopy and its associated in terms of combination of soft corals and hard corals and proportion of each types of coral forms within it. So you cannot use the same parameter for its conservation everywhere. It has to be site specific conservation measure. Mangrove again a very, very useful ecosystem as an interface between land and sea. They grow in very saline areas and they really provide an excellent buffer in case of high surges, strong winds, cyclones, etc., etc. If you look at the status of mangrove, and if you look at certain states like Gujarat and Maharashtra, in Maharashtra, in fact, these are some of the old figures. And if you look at, I should add actually 2020 figures, there is a significant increase in Gujarat, for example, from 427 kilometers to about 1,000 plus in 2011. It is much more now. Same is the case for Maharashtra, where almost 100 plus square kilometer, has been added recently into mangrove areas. The sad part of it is that all these mangrove have come up in non-vegetative mudflats. So we have destroyed some of the best mudflats. Those are used by migratory birds. And that's why I'm saying that such kind of an approach will require very careful restoration policies. It cannot be based on, it's open area, let's do some plantation. I think that's a very bad strategy. In many places, mangrove cover has increased, especially in Maharashtra, is primarily because of saltwater ingress into agricultural land. And we are currently looking at which areas within Ratnagiri, Sindhudurga, and Raigad district are vulnerable and actually got converted into saline areas and mangroves because of saltwater ingress due to sea level rise. And it's a significant rise in that sense. So on one side, we are very, very happy that mangrove cover has increased, but there is a deep conflict because of this particular situation, because people have lost their agricultural land. Seagrass beds, again, very less known ecosystem we have, but there are two charismatic species dependent entirely on seagrass, like green sea turtle and dugong, which feed exclusively on seagrasses. But it's a very, very, again, very, very important ecosystem to say. Mudflats, I have been talking about it, so I'm not going to speak much about it. We have no short of mudflats. Actually, we have a large number of good mudflats. Gujarat is one state which is blessed with extensive mudflats. So is Andhra Pradesh, West Bengal, and Andaman Nicobar. And these are very, very important states in terms of migratory water birds. Sandy shores and sand dunes, all of us are aware of it, so I'm not going to speak on that. But there are the flora and fauna depends on the types of sandy shore, whether it's reflective, dissipative, or intermediate. We again have got extensive sandy shore, mostly on the east coast. West coast has relatively very less sandy areas. Gujarat has got highest, followed by Maharashtra. But east coast on Tamil Nadu has got almost 10,000 hectare. Andhra has got 16,000 hectare. Andaman Nicobar has got 10,000 hectare. So pristine and beautiful sandy areas, followed by sand dunes. Unfortunately, sand dunes we have lost in many, many places. There are very, very few good quality sand dunes are left. Some of the best sand dunes are left either in the northern part of Gulf of Kutch in Mandvi and that region, or in Orissa or in Andhra. Otherwise, in Maharashtra, we virtually lost all good quality sand dunes because of all these plantations that we have done for Casuarina. It's a very unfortunate story of uh, unplanned, plantation that we have been doing left and right. Intertidal areas again are best access. I think this is one of the most studied ecosystem we have in India, because here you can go twice a day, morning and evening. At places you will get very long exposures during low tide, depending on the tidal amplitude, and that gives you good amount of time to document biodiversity in that sense. But these areas are extremely dynamic because every day twice they get exposed to the elements of surface. uh, Daytime it's a temperature, and summer temperature can go as high as 45, and tide pools become really hot soup. So here tolerance limit of animals is very high. From winter 20 degrees to 45 degrees in summer and during low tides, and therefore you will have much more diversification of speciation that you will see in intertidal areas. And then coastal lagoons, we have got some of the best lagoons important for migratory birds like Chilka and Pulikat on east coast of India. On west coast, we have marine lagoons which are in Lakshadweep. Otherwise, we have got Vembanad and Ashtamudi, which are again very important in terms of livelihood point of view. Atolls, very distinct and unique ecosystem. I had pleasure and privilege working here for almost more than 2.5 decades, and I spent almost 10 years on the islands when I was doing Project Giant Clam work since 2003 to 2013. And it's a place you have to visit once in your lifetime to understand sheer beauty of these atolls and these waters here. Uh, very beautiful place, and I will soon be going back to where I belong to, not far from now, uh, back to Lakshadweep to do what I really enjoy working uh, on. I'm not really going to go through this very complex subject of micro niches. It essentially are, the specialized habitats which many of these species require. And unless you understand these micro niches, understanding marine biodiversity is practically impossible. I mean, many a times when you go to sandy shores or rocky shores, they look practically barren, but they're not barren really. There are micro niches, and unless you understand these micro niches, now, for example, these rocky platforms, they transform every month differently. Look at how it looks. The previous slide, this in monsoon, in early winter, early to late winter, is full of different kind of green, red, and brown algae. And within a fraction of time, between May to June, it get transformed into completely different seascape. And these are the dynamic processes that a student has to understand, because what you are going to find depends on what is the status of habitat in that particular period of time. And therefore, no amount of data, if you do not collect it seasonally, monthly, you will never be able to get accurate enumeration of species in that particular area. Because for many species, lifespan is very small. Now, for example, if you want to, search for sea slugs, you have to go into these crevices, look for hydroids on which or sponges on which most of the slugs feed for. Unless you search for this, you will never be able to see them on surface roaming. Look at border fields. This is how upper image. Look at how they look dull and drab and dead. If you look at from a distance, just turn around that boulder and see how beautiful complex of sponges, bryozoans is there on the lower side of the rocks. So there are two different life for this, barren looking seascape. You need to understand these dynamics if you really want to understand the marine and coastal biodiversity. Platforms again very interesting. You'll see most of the time in coastal Konkan, excellent areas to explore, full of zoanthus and very interesting biodiversity. A lot of these tide pools, rock pools, what we call it as a three-dimensional space within two-dimensional ecosystem. A very interesting aspect for PhD students, those who want to pursue the rock pool ecology itself can be a fascinating topic for PhD if somebody want to do. And then algal beds, and all these are very important niches that one has to understand. And I'm going to finish with only 3 or 4 slides of conservation issues. I'm not going to give a lecture on this. I think the biggest challenge that we have is the way we are altering our coastal areas in the form of all kinds of development. Some of it is genuine, some of it is not so genuine. But yet is going to alter the characteristics of our shore. All these small dots, garland-like thing you see is essentially are all different kinds of projects that either are there or coming up in terms of structures, in terms of ports, in terms of power plants, shipyards, shipbreaking units, and so on and so forth. So if we have this kind of a developmental agenda for coast, our coast definitely are going to change its characteristics in a very short span of time. And another issue that very little we can do as researcher or conservationists to mitigate this impact of El Nino and coral bleaching. I mean, this is one of the biggest threat to our coral reefs that we have is 1 degree centigrade has an ability to alter marine communities. I have recently published a paper on anomalous behavior of sea surface temperature and conservation implication. Those who want to read, I can send a PDF. It's in a very good journal, and we are almost now reefs, especially in Lakshadweep, we believe that they are closing into thermal maxima. What you mean by thermal maxima, and how we can deal with this phenomenon of thermal maxima? Thermal maxima is corals cannot sustain seawater temperature more than 29 degrees centigrade. The moment it crosses 29, this is how they will bleach. Giant clam will bleach probably at 30 or 31 degrees centigrade. So they are much more resilient compared to corals. Corals are relatively having low resilience in terms of temperature. And if you see the trajectories of sea surface temperature in Indian Ocean region, including our areas of Lakshadweep, Andaman Nicobar, Gulf of Mannar, we are consistently between 28 to 30 in between that range. And we don't know whether this is going to be a new normal in terms of sea surface temperature, or will this change over time? And that is one of the important reasons why you need to monitor this ecosystem on a very, very long time series scale. You cannot go there for 3 years, do research, and come out with some fantastic recommendations, which I believe are futile, pointless, and absurd. And many a times I have seen, even among conservationists, people coming out with some unbelievable recommendation for restoration without even knowing how these ecosystems are going to behave with this sea surface anomalous behavior and other anthropogenic stresses that we have. Unless you have 3-4 decades data, in fact, our intervention, if they are unscientific, can be more dangerous because we don't know what kind of characteristic alteration we will do with this kind of study. Now, at least for Lakshadweep, for example, I have been working there for last 2 decades, so we have got fairly decent understanding of how the reefs are behaving and how this entire structure of reef is behaving in context of sea surface temperature. And that science has to be understood when we develop the mitigation strategy. Jellyfish invasion, we are getting year after year cases of jellyfish invading all seas globally, not just in India. And one of the reason, of course, is increasing sea surface temperature. At the same time, a lot of artificial structure providing abundant space for anchorage of jellyfish. And that's how these blooms look. It's almost unpenetrable. It has deep impact on fisheries. And unless we understand the behavior and the dispersal of this resource, all our fishing strategies depends on how the ecosystems behave. Therefore, monitoring of this is very, very important. I'm not going to run through this. I will share the presentation if you want. And climate change is going to be mother of all conservation issues. I mean, there is still debate within countries, to what level climate is changing, whether it should be 1.5, 2.5, 3.5. And I will not go into those technical jargons, but climate is changing. There is no doubt about it. And it will influence vast population in a very short span of time. That's also a reality. We are already seeing its consequences. These seas that you see in Mumbai, for many it looks as great joyful events, water splashing during high tides in monsoon. But down the line, 2 decades, 3 decades, this very happy kind of images will turn into an absolute tragedy for most of the coastal areas because you cannot limit sea. Sea will maintain its boundaries. If you do build something on this side, it will take land somewhere else. That's the simple principle of ocean, that you cannot make the boundaries for the ocean. And therefore, the only best way to mitigate sea level rise is to take a step backward and see how we can strengthen our coastal buffer between sea and land in terms of mangroves, in terms of reefs, in terms of submerged sandbanks, etc., etc. We need to be innovative to deal with this issue. And therefore, we have to look at conservation in a very, very different and very, very holistic and a balanced context. I think today's conservation community is uh, divided like anything before. I had never seen such a fragmented conservation community today, where on one side we say oppose everything, and other group says no, no, let's do whatever we want. I think answer is somewhere in between, and that in between many a times is very, very difficult to achieve, because we have, as a nature of human being, we have become very, very rigid in every sense. My way is a highway is kind of an approach today we have in most of these conservation realms, which is unfortunate, because if you do not understand the science correctly of ocean, all that we will end up doing is more damage than good in terms of ocean conservation. So we have to look at science very carefully, very meticulously. These are not very simple ecosystems. These are very, very complex and very, very dynamic ecosystems. They have withstood all kind of violent events of Earth for millions and millions of years. They are not the one. We have to see our vulnerability, our resilience, rather than looking at other way. That's where the answer lies, as to how we are going to respond to this changing climate. Instead of controlling climate, I think we have to control ourselves and our actions to be able to, have better resilience against this changing climate. Thank you, Shashi and Madhuriji.